Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we march with the Immortals, the elite guard of King Xerxes, to see what life was truly like in the heart of his great army. This immersive story is shaped by the most important accounts we have from Richard Stoneman's works on Xerxes and the Persian Empire, and Stephen Ward's history of the Immortals. To bring the ancient world closer to us, imagine the weight of your spear, the dust of the royal road under your sandals, and the clash of bronze at Thermopylae. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you as a fellow knight of these tales to like and subscribe, and in the comments share what other period of history you would like to experience. Now steady your shield, the march begins. Chapter 1. From Susa to the Drill Yard. Our story begins in Susa. Imagine you are an immortal in the year 480 BCE, standing in a palace city where baked brick walls hold in the heat and wide courtyards lie plain as sandals move over packed earth. The streets are steady with traders and scribes, and a line of boys races a stray dog past the gate. Word passes in quiet ways that a march will cross the empire, out toward a hard pass in the west where a narrow way meets the sea, and stubborn men stand in it. People say there will be a test of our king's will there, and they nod like they have seen such things before. That is how rumors work in a big house. They drift in and settle. But for now there is only the drill yard and the steady rhythm that keeps soldiers ready for whatever comes. The day holds its shape, the officer checks the lists, and a comrade ties a strap once more to be sure it will not slip. No one needs to hurry yet, and that is a mercy before a long road. A warm smell of dust rose from the ground as feet scraped the familiar path, and it made the hours slow and calm, which was always the best setting for clear thoughts. Mornings began with quiet order, and the guard lines formed in the yard like rows in a garden. The captain started at one end and moved along, watching mouths and hands to see who dared talk before duty. Names were given with a nod, one by one, like seeds counted into a jar. The drill master had a short stick and a patient way, and he kept the count and the time without fuss. It felt simple, and simple was safe when days might change without warning. A small knot of men stood apart, fresh from country posts, listening hard and trying to match the old hands. That was the way of things. Someone was always new, and someone was always steady. The palace lay behind with its painted halls, and ahead stood the open space that belonged to the ranks. A line of sunlight was drawn across the hard ground, and it showed where the morning would pull us, which seemed a kind promise for work that never ended. Armament was not grand in the way people in markets like to tell it, though it did its work. The wicker spara came up to the shoulder when raised, and it could make a wall when friends stood close together. A strap ran around the arm so a hand stayed free, and that saved time when orders changed fast. At the belt, the shorter kinakes sat ready, a quiet tool for the close press. Folks in town liked to say such things made a man brave, but in truth, habit did the heavy lifting. A habit of cleaning the edge, a habit of checking the stitching, a habit of looking to the man on the left. That was how fear stayed small, and duty stayed big. There was nothing shiny about it, not on most days. The itch of linen under the armor reminded every man where the body ended and the task began, and it kept the mind on simple checks, which was good for the heart. Drill was never meant to please a crowd. Files formed, then broke, then formed again, while the officer called sets that matched what might come on a road or a hill. The elder men were the spine, and the younger ones learned to lean into that spine without letting it bend. When the command for shields came, arms came up together, not because of pride, but because it had been done that way yesterday and the day before. This was the craft. Ranks held the weight of the shield wall and learned how to step as one, heel to toe, so lines stayed straight. A stranger might have seen only a dull dance, but it was what would decide who came home. No one said it in a grand way, yet it was known. In the end, the simplest moves saved the most lives. The thud of many feet rising and falling as one beat out the time, and it set a plain rhythm that made hard work go by without dread. Between drills there was food, and food carried a kind of truth that talk could not. A man shared what he had, and took what was given in turn, and a captain knew more by watching that than by any speech. Bread was torn, no knives for that job, and stew had more water than meat on most days. It filled the belly all the same, which was the point. Coins were counted in small piles now and then, and promises were sent home on the same day, folded into words with a friend's help if letters were needed. That was how a house stayed steady when a man was gone. One soldier showed a scrap of cloth with his child's stitch, and grinned in a way that told more than 100 boasts. The taste of salted fish sat on the tongue, and made the mouth water for a moment, and that small sharp note felt like a gift in a plain meal. Evenings were for cleaning gear and mending straps, and then for the slow easing of voices into stories. The young ones asked about far places, and the older ones answered without trying to sound grand. They spoke of roads that went on and on, of tents in wind, and of kings who were both near and far at the same time. Laughter came when someone told about a mule that would not be led until it had its share of dates, and there was a lesson in it about patience that everyone understood. This was the wide life narrowed to a circle of men who had to trust one another in the next hard hour whenever it came. That trust was the real armor, and people knew it without saying. The lamp flame wavered in its saucer of oil and made faces look softer, and that gentle light made the yard feel like a home that belonged to duty as much as to any one man. There were stories told about the Immortals that ran faster than truth, and they had their use, but living was not a fable. People in markets liked to say our number never fell, and that made enemies worry. In the lines, the way it worked was plain. When one fell ill or aged out, another stepped in from the reserve, and the count was right again by the next muster. It looked like magic from far away, but up close it was only order. Pride had a place, but it sat beside patience if it wanted to do any good. New men watched the front files the same way a son watched his father tie a knot, and that is how skill passed hand to hand. No one grew 10 feet tall because a title liked him. The cool rim of a bronze cup touched the lip during a pause, and the small chill reminded a man to breathe and take stock, which was the wise habit before long marches. The order to prepare did not shout its way through the camp. It came by quiet steps and firm faces that had seen this dance before. Packs were set out, laces checked, letters tucked into inner folds where a hand could find them fast. A friend nodded, then another, each one letting the next know that the time had come to move within the same hour as always. The West was a word passed without a map, but everyone understood what it meant. A road, a duty, a place where paths narrowed and will was tested. It never felt like a tale while it was happening. It felt like one more turn of a wheel that had been turning since grandfathers walked. That was a comfort in its own way. The slow beat of the gate drum carried over the yard and set a calm pace in the chest, and the knights settled around the ranks, ready to hand the morning over to the road. Chapter 2: Crossing the King's Road. The march began with the king's host stretching out from the courtyards of Susa, and the Immortals set their place near the center where order held best. Packs sat right, water skins rested at the hip, and the first steps came steady as if the ground itself approved. A clerk counted ranks with a small tablet, and an officer nodded at each file that kept the pace. The road had been planned by men long dead, but it still guided living feet like a firm hand. There were jokes about old boots and young blisters, and the kind of easy lines men used to turn weight into light talk. A veteran reminded the newest faces that a slow army lasted longer than a fast one, which was the sort of truth a boy could carry for years. Cool air brushed the cheeks at dawn and made breath feel clean, and it helped the thought that one step followed another, simple and sure. It felt like the beginning of something that had no name yet, and that was often the way of great journeys. You tried not to chase the end in your head. The order was clear: walk, keep place, and trust the road. The royal road held mileposts that stood like quiet watchers, and way stations broke the long spaces where water and grain waited under seal. An archer ahead kept his head turning in a set rhythm, because that was how a line stayed safe without noise. Couriers came and went with small flares of dust, and their speed matched the pulse of the day, not rushing, not slow. The files closed and opened around broken ground, and then settled again, like breath coming back after a climb. There were thoughts about home that rose and fell, never loud, and no one said much about them. A decent road made men think the empire had a fair spine, and that belief helped tired legs more than pride did. The sight of the stone markers, carved and simple, drew the eye along the way and made distance feel counted and fair. A steady rule kept fear small, and it was enough just to feel that rule underfoot. Words from officers were plain: hold rank, drink when told, speak low. That was the way of things in a broad land held by many hands. Songs came out of the middle of the line and rolled forward by a few dozen voices at a time, not loud and not for show. A half-joke would drift down the files and loosen shoulders where burdens sat. The day settled into parts: morning miles, a halt at noon, afternoon miles, a camp with stakes and rope, and a last round of checks before sleep. A man beside asked after a cousin in another regiment, and the answer took a while to find, but no one hurried it. The Immortals set an example without saying they did, and that kind of quiet pride moved farther than banners. Rations went out in fair hands, and a captain made a point to pass a bag to the youngest recruit first. The rhythm made minds clear, and clear minds did not make trouble. The sound of sandals beating the packed earth in time with the soft march chant steadied the heart like a drum that never tired. If worry tried to climb up the back, the song pressed it down again. Order had a way of making long days fit inside simple words. Sardis sat with its roofs near the hillside, and the host rested outside its walls in neat rows that matched the fields. Traders came with dates, figs, and a kind of walnut paste, and a few coins passed, though the men did not need much. A captain let the ranks drill in a town square to keep form, and a judge of weights watched with a grin, which made even stern faces ease a little. Talk said the road beyond would bend toward the strait that men spoke of with a trace of swagger, as if naming a great beast. An Immortal checked the shorter kinakes at the belt, and made sure the strap lay flat. Not for show, just for habit. The sparrer hung near the bedroll at night, where a hand could find it in the dark, because that was how a shield stayed honest. The taste of a sweet date paste on the tongue at evening felt like a fair gift from the day, modest and enough. That small kindness helped a man share a story before sleep. Work felt lighter when it ended with a touch of something good, and that truth never aged. From Sardis, the road turned to the coast, and the line thinned to pass through narrow places where carts had chewed the ground. Officers spaced files so wagons could move without turning men into a knot. Abydos waited beyond, and there the sea lay between the army and the land ahead, which meant carpenters would show their worth. Boats were hauled, ropes were drawn, and long timbers came down from carts on shoulders that did not complain in words. A row of soldiers stood as a quiet wall, while the builders measured spans with knotted cords. It was the sort of work that grew from task to task, each step simple, but each needed the one before. The ring of mallets on iron pegs rose and fell in a steady beat, and that beat carried through the whole shore like a second march. If anyone doubted the crossing, he saw hands making a way where none had been. Men trusted what they could watch become real under the sun, and that trust was as good as a promise. When the strait came close, it offered no words, just its reach and its pull, and the idea of Greece on the far side. The king looked on from a raised place with guards kept neat, and officers went from plank to mark what still needed doing. The talk in the ranks stayed low, built on simple faith in plan and timber. Older men said that the sea had moods like a person, and that it needed respect, not fear, which felt like something learned hard over years. Ropes were set to anchors, boats were brought into line, and planks would soon turn moving water into a road. A scribe read a list to make sure no gear was left in the rush, and it sounded like care, not fuss. The salt smell lifted from the Hellespont, and stood in the nose like a sign that the world was changing, and it made thoughts run cool and clear for a moment. That kind of smell did not lie. It said the army had reached the edge of one land and put a hand on another. A first file stepped out on the near span to test the weight, and the boards held with a small give that told the truth of wood. Guards kept eyes along the sides, while men placed feet where chalk marks showed the safest line. The word went down to leave space, to keep the pace even, and to look ahead, not down. That advice felt kinder than it sounded. Standard bearers took the slowest beat anyone could stand without losing time, and every shoulder followed. A man felt the sparrer settle into a better place against his back once he stopped thinking about it, which often solved more problems than worry did. Ropes stayed taut at the edges of the bridge, and builders watched knots like shepherds watch lambs. The slight sway under boot soles ran through the calves and up the legs in a living way, and the body learned it and matched it, steady and plain. When the test file came back, the smiles were small but real. Faith grew best from things tried and found sound. Camp rose on the shore with lines drawn straight, and watch fires marked both banks so that no one forgot how wide the work had grown. The king's tent stood with a clear path to it, and men took turns on guard, one eye on the bridge, one on the shore road. Stories moved from circle to circle about old marches and good luck, and someone told how a father once crossed a river on a fallen cedar, which made even this feat feel like part of a long chain. Rice and barley boiled in pots, and officers walked the rows with plain words for the morning. A few letters got scratched onto thin wood for homes far off, and a clerk promised to send them when a courier went back. The sight of the watchlights pricking the dark like distant neighbors kept the camp calm, because a little light made big tasks feel close to hand. It had been a day of building and waiting, and both had value. The bridge would carry the host, and the road would lead south in the morning toward the narrow way others spoke about. That was enough to let a man sleep. Chapter 3. First Assault at the Hot Gates. You stepped into the narrow way at the Hot Gates with files drawn tight and shields held high. The road bent between steep ground and the sea, and the place left no room for show. The Immortals stood with spear points level, waiting for the word. Officers walked along the line and set every space, and no one wasted breath. The men had done this so many times that the feet found their stations without thought. The word came down that the day would start with arrows, then the push. That was the way of the king's war. Test, then press. Minds went steady, and fear stayed where it could be managed. Stories had painted the Greeks as stubborn, but every wall had a gate when hands held together. That was a thought that kept the mind steady. Over the stones lay the sharp sulfur smell from the hot spring by the road, and it sat inside the nose like a warning. It made the place feel close and old. It did not change the work, and it gave a small sense that the land itself watched. The files set weight forward as morning grew, and a calm sat on the line, because rhythm held worry at arm's length. Orders stayed simple, and the day began in good order. A comrade beside tightened a grip and nodded. That nod said more than talk. It was the old way of men who trusted the line. When the bowmen stepped up, the front ranks leaned their shields and waited for the sign. The captains raised hands, and strings were drawn. No one in the files blinked at the timing, since this start had been taught often. A path for the shafts had been set in the mind before dawn, and that plan held. You kept weight even, and breath even, because steady bodies made steady ranks. Then the sign came, and volleys went out from our side across the narrow space. The thin hiss of the arrows slid over the pass and told that the work had begun. Men counted on that sound to carry courage. It was not magic, but it was a habit that helped. Again the hands went up, again the strings pulled, and the air over the pass filled and emptied in turns. The front kept ready for the return, for a wall answers a wall. The archers did their trade and stepped aside by measure, and the next wave formed. That flow had been drilled, and there was comfort in the known steps. The mind fixed on place and count, and the body did what it had learned. Even the heel knew where to set down. The push came when the sign ran down the ranks, and the files moved as one. Spear points held level, the front took short steps, and the long line crept into the choke of the pass. Ahead stood the Greek phalanx packed with men behind wide shields. It did not shift much, and that told its own tale. The first touch of spear to shield felt like the meeting of two carts on a tight track, all strain and no space to spare. Then the weight of men met, and every inch cost time. The clang of bronze answered each shove and thrust, a hard ringing that set along the bones like a hammer on iron. That sound had a way of fixing the mind on one job: keep the point forward and the feet set. It was never about rage, not in that place. It was about small steps and calm hands. Officers called the count and kept the gaps from opening. The Greeks worked their own count, tight and close, and changed the men at the front without breaking the face. That had to be respected. In narrow ground, tidy work mattered more than size. Inside the squeeze, the front learned the worth of pacing and breath. Lines held the space of a man's shoulders, and anything more brought trouble. A comrade beside nudged for room, and the file gave it without fuss. The wicker shield at the arm, the sparrer, took the worst of the pushes and kept a shape between body and point. The rough weave rubbed the inside of the forearm with each press and shift, and the scrape reminded that the arm had to stay strong. That was the way of simple gear. It did its task if the hand did its part. Spear butts knocked the stone, points sought gaps, and the edge between men and wall never stayed still. Still the file kept the count, and the ranks behind fed in fresh men when the front tired. Talk in the back stayed low. It was not the hour for pride, just clear duty. The thought ran down the line that a gate could open if the rhythm held. That idea kept faces set and calm. At one time, the men ahead of us seemed to give ground in tight order, and the front leaned in a step more. It looked like a door about to swing, and a door draws the hand toward it. You took that step because the line had to keep pace, and no one wished to leave a gap. Then the Greeks came back with a snap, and the front learned in a breath that the space had been a lure. That happened in war, and it stung no less for being known. A man to the right lost his spear point to a cut and went down to one knee, and the next rank closed without fuss. The bite of the spear haft in the teeth held the hands steady while the gap mended. The taste of salt spread in the mouth, sharp and plain, and it made the head clear. That kind of taste had visited many fields and always told the same tale. Live through the next count and then the next. The shove settled again, and the press held. A second drive formed after officers pulled the first wave back a few paces and set a fresh front. Archers shot once more by plan, and then the files went in again. Everyone knew the ground now, and no one looked for an easy give. The Greeks kept their face smooth and made room to bring up rested men, and that choice told us we would be there a while. We tried small steps to an edge, then to the middle, then back to an edge, feeling for a loose spot. A man ahead marked their leader and set his point that way. Since a body follows ahead, one red cloak showed at the front, like a mark on a board, clear against the tight mass. That one sharp color drew the eye and held it, as signs do. We leaned that way for a count, but the press did not break. Even in the heat of drive, a kind of respect grew for their steady way. That was fine. Respect did not remove duty, it only shaped how one kept it. When the day had begun to drag, the signal came to draw back in order and set a shielded line to cover it. The front stepped the space of 2 paces, then the next, and so on, while the rear rose to meet us. No man turned aback, not in that place. The captains called the measure, and the ranks moved by count and not by rush. That kind of neat pull saved men and kept honor clean. A messenger went past with word for the next group to take the face, and the wounded slid off to the aid place. The drum behind beat a slow, even mark, one round note after another, and it held the feet to the same calm path. That kind of sound had kept order since before our fathers marched. It reminded that an army was a body, and a body has a pulse. The line came back to the post set for it, and the press at the front eased enough to breathe right. It had not been our gate, not that time, that was plain. Evening came on with men sorting gear and counting spears, and talk stayed low, small words traded in the spaces between orders. Water went round, and the cooks set the meal. A scribe came to note names for pay and for the wounded, and he worked with care, the way such work should be done. Men sat in small knots and set their thoughts right. It was the time when a soldier learned again that courage was not noise, but a steady hand with simple tasks. A comrade told a small jest and won a few grins, as men will when the day has been hard. Smoke from the cook fires drifted through the camp and carried the clean smell of burning wood, and it drew heads up like a beacon. It meant food, and it meant a night that still belonged to us. The officers walked the lines and said we would try another way to open the road. That promise had a quiet weight. The pass had not moved, and neither would we. The file lay down with kits under heads, and sleep came as it always did when duty had been done for the day. Chapter 4, The Night Flank on Anopia. The column wound along the high path, while Hydarnes led from the front, and a local guide kept close to him, and every file kept the same gap so no man brushed the edge. Steps took the slope in a patient climb because haste on a path meant a tumble, and that would shame a company that had drilled since Susa. Packs rode tight, shields hung by cords, and spears were carried low so the points did not catch on roots. The plan had been simple when the officers set it out on the shore. Move by night above the pass, find the back way, and turn the men who held the narrow road. The king wanted the gate opened, and the Immortals were given the task because order under strain was their trade. A comrade beside kept count of strides the way old drill masters taught, so the mind stayed steady and the body followed the rhythm. Few words passed, for hands and the tilt of a spear told enough. The damp smell of pine rode the track with the column. It kept the thought fixed that this was not a tale from the courtyards, but a real ridge with real roots underfoot. Yet even then it felt like any march, just another duty done in the dark. That was the way of things. Files held tight as the ground pitched and then leveled, and the rank leaders made sure the line breathed but did not open. Men kept the same shoulder-to-shoulder shape that had been drilled under the hard sun, though here it was a mountain with a drop on one side that the mind tried not to weigh. Weighted cloaks rested across backs so straps did not bite, and the bow cases rode across hips with knots tied by habit learned on long roads. A runner moved between officers with the simple sign to keep pace and save breath for the climb. One man took a strap from a mate and passed it forward, not because he was asked, but because that was the kind of small favor that held a line in hard places. The soft scrape of sandals on stone marked the only rhythm needed. It was a line of small sounds that kept the group one shape instead of many men. Thoughts went to the first push at the pass, and how the Greek shield wall had held when spears met shield. But that was not this task. This was a turning move, step after step, where patience was the sharper edge. In any army, a quiet march like this did half the work before a fight. So it went. The guide, a man of this country named Ephialtes, walked a pace off Hydarnes and showed a bend that did not look like a path until feet proved it. He had come to the camp with plain clothes, a short beard, and steady eyes, and he spoke with a calm face that said he knew each stone by memory. Some in the ranks gave him narrow looks, not from anger, but from the old rule that a stranger was weighed by his deeds and not his words. Still the general chose, and the line obeyed, since that was the bond that fed and paid the families far away. The path broke into a saddle between two shoulders of land, and men took turns to steady each other at a loose place. It was the kind of teamwork that drill built without anyone saying a thing. The thin line of stars between branches gave just enough to keep the column aimed. A man near the rear mouthed a few words from a song about steady feet, not to sing it but to borrow its beat and carry the mind across the ridge. Trust had to be simple here. The guide knew the way, Hydarnes chose the pace, and the rest kept shape. That was the bargain on a long night. Farther on, the path rose sharp along a spur that made the thighs burn and the breath work harder, and the officers signaled shorter steps to save strength. Packs slid and were set right again with short motions, and men leaned a little forward so the center stayed over the feet. No one wanted a stumble to ripple down the files, because in a tight place, one fall became 10 in a blink, and that would stain the company with needless loss. A comrade ahead reached back once, and a wrist was taken and guided across a notch in the rock. After that, the line found a groove and moved in the same order it started with, which was the mark of soldiers who had learned to share weight and keep calm. The rough bark under the palm at a waist-high root gave a sure hold at the worst pitch. That bit of grip felt like a gift from the mountain to men who had come so far to do a hard, plain job. Thoughts ran to the drill yard behind Susa, where the masters had said that slopes taught their own lessons if a man kept his temper. They were right. A path like this wore away pride and left only the work. That was a good thing. The ridge eased, and a whisper from the front passed by hand, sign that a guard force held a post ahead, men from a nearby city who had been set to watch the back road. Hydarnes chose a firm pace toward them, and the front ranks set shields in front and lowered spear tips so each file could present a tight face if the watch stood to fight. It did not take long for the first shaft to come out from the scrub as the guard tried to slow the move, and the archers in our files stepped up to return. A pair of shieldmen took a knee and gave cover so string hands could work. The hiss of arrows slid over the ridge like grass in a wind. The line did not break to chase, because the task was not to climb a small hill and trade losses in the dark. The task was to go past, and that called for a steady mind and a trust in the shape of the line. The Greeks on that post were not fools. They felt what was happening and pulled to a rise where their shields made sense and their spears had room. That was brave work in a hard spot. Duty met duty there, and both sides did what their fathers would have told them to do. Orders went down that the files would hold the guard in place with a taste of arrows while the rest slid by on the lower side, and so hands moved to make it happen with no need for voices. Rank leaders pointed, pairs shifted a step, and gaps closed like a door, so the shape kept its strength. The front edge raised shields and kept steady, and the bowmen loosed in a slow count that had been trained on ranges far from this mountain. The guard pulled to their hill and shook their spears, and for a breath it felt like a start of something larger. But Hydarnes lifted his arm and sent the column on. The faint grit on the teeth told how near the ground the mouths had been, as men leaned low to pass. It was not elegant, but it was wise. The road to the pass lay ahead, and the king's will lay with it, and no one in the line mistook pride for purpose. There was no need to win a hill that did not open the gate. A comrade squeezed a forearm as the path turned and the burden shifted. That small press said enough. It said that order was held, and the work was not done yet. Soon the ground tipped toward the rear of the narrow road where the main Greek body held the way, and the files began to feel the ease that came when a high task neared its end. Hydarnes sent runners along the slope to mark bends and check for a wider way, and they came back with simple signs that it could be done if the pace stayed true. Each man in the files set his thoughts straight, shield forward, spear ready, mind cool. Weight moved step by step so the company would arrive in a strong shape and not a string of tired pairs. The low glow of watchfires far below marked where the men at the gate kept their night. That sight made the plan feel like a line being drawn from map to ground. No one in the ranks dreamed of grand tales then. It was just a turn, timed and simple, made by men who knew their place in a long order. The guide moved to one side and pointed, and Hydarnes nodded once and set the angle. Even fear had a place and was kept in a pocket, where it could not rule the hands. That was the craft learned in quiet yards and on long roads. When the path bent at last to the last spur above the pass, the company paused to let the rear close and to count the files again. A few men rubbed the cords of their shield grips, and spear points were checked by touch, not out of doubt, but because that was how a man made sure the mind would not wander when things began. Rations waited in packs for later, and there was no thought of them now. Thoughts moved only to spacing, and to the simple shape of what would come when light raised shapes on the road below. The officers set each group in the order to press down when the signal came, and the archers stood where they could send shafts if a sudden push rose from the guard behind. The cool dew on the cloak at the shoulders told how near the night was to its end. It was a small thing, and said the task had been done in the time it was meant to be done. A comrade beside let out a breath and rolled his shoulders once, and that was all the show of strain that was given. Soon the host below would learn the turn. For now the line held steady and waited for the next step. That is how such nights ended. Chapter 5. South to the burned city. The host left the pass as if a gate had been opened by a quiet hand, and the road ahead widened into a long valley that drew the ranks forward. Word moved down the files that Leonidas had fallen, and that his men had stayed where they stood until they could not stand any longer, which was the kind of talk that gave shape to a day. Men said the king would take Athens, and the guides pointed south as if the earth itself wished us there. The carts came on behind with steady patience while the baggage men counted loads, and nothing seemed strange yet, only larger. There was a time when the tales of Greece felt like songs, but the march turned songs into work, and that was the way of things. A comrade beside kept a thumb under his jaw as though to hold in the things he would not say, and the officer ahead kept his pace square to set an example. We had won a path, and paths always begged to be walked, so the line answered. Off to the left, over the low ridges, a long grey smear lay across the sky, like a brush stroke that refused to fade, and the sight held the eye, the way a worry holds a house. It felt like the season had changed even though the dates on the strap were the same, and so the march carried on. Villages on the flats had been emptied before we reached them, and a few huts had been burned by men who knew the land and wanted to slow our steps. The stubble in the fields told that the harvest had fled with the people, leaving stems that snapped under sandals in a simple answer to our presence. Orders went out to keep ranks tight and fires low, and the standard moved like a calm hand through the dust, firm and clear. There was talk that some Phocians had tried to fight in the hills and had been scattered, but talk was wind, and the officer said wind did not carry loads. A line of cattle wandered free along a stone fence and blinked at us, in a way that felt almost like judgment, though beasts knew nothing of kings. The farther south we went, the more the empty doors seemed to watch, and the men stopped pointing to them after a time. Every hour or so the column paused, and the throat stung with smoke that drifted down from huts still smouldering on a far slope, a small pain that sat where breath should rest. It had a way of reminding a man that every step meant something to someone, even when we could not see who that someone was. Camp that night spread along a shallow stream, and the cook fires came on in small circles while sentries stepped off their posts. The barley bread went round, and an onion was split with a quiet joke that drew a grin from a tired face. A new man from the east asked how many Spartans had been at the pass, and the old comrade shrugged as if to say numbers were stones that sank when thrown too far. Someone said the Greeks were iron, and someone else said they were only men, and both thoughts could live in the same bowl without a fight. The stars were clear, and the map men traced the route in the dirt with a stick, while the rest of us let the day ease its grip. A handful mouthed a short prayer for steady feet and clear eyes, the simple kind that fits on a breath. The cups went round with a thin wine that steadied the hands as well as the mind. The clink of bronze cups felt like a small promise passed between us, a sound that said we were still a company and would be again tomorrow. In quiet, the old man said that glory was a young word, while duty had grey hair, and no one argued with that. At first light, the host rolled forward again, and the pace settled into a rhythm that made thought plain and simple. Harness got checked, buckles were tugged, and the line shrugged off the stiffness of a short sleep with a few muttered jokes that needed no reply. A man near the front cleaned his short sword and called it by its name, Achaemenid, as if saying it would make the steel hold its edge through another day, which was only human. Before stepping out, a few of us raised a hand toward the sun and said the name of Ahura Mazda in a quiet way, not for victory, but for upright steps. It was not a grand thing, just the way a day began, when men were far from home. The old officer walked along the line and looked at hands, not faces, because hands told him if a man was ready. He stopped once to help a young file leader twist a strap tight and nodded when it sat right. The leather underfinger ran smooth with fresh oil, and the easy slide of it against skin felt like a small order kept in a world where big things were messy. In that touch, a man remembered who he was, and the march seemed less large. By noon we passed fields that should have been full of voices, but grain heads bowed on their stems with no one to tend them, and the path turned toward the sea and a city much told in stories. The land threw low hills against the road like a hand spread to slow a child, and we wound through them at a steady pace. Guides said that many had taken to boats and crossed to an island not far off, and that the houses we would find were likely to be empty. There was a quiet in the ranks that came when men knew they were walking into a place they had heard about since first drill, and found the tales thinner than the work. A comrade said Athens was said to be sharp like a blade, and another said blades rust if left in the rain, which drew a soft smile that did no harm. The flags kept their easy rise and fall, and the carts held the pace with patient creaks we did not think about. We entered the edge of Attica, through fields where farms had opened their gates and left them open, and the sight of doorways left wide like mouths felt strange to steady eyes. It reminded a man that stories often forgot the quiet parts that mattered most. The city itself waited like a room someone had left in a hurry, with chairs pulled back and nothing on the table, and the high rock above held a few who stayed behind out of stubborn need. Another part of the host took the steep ground with ladders and fire, while our file held the road and watched the standard. Someone said the shrine had been a fine place, and someone else said shrines were in the heart as much as in stone, and that eased a hard thought. We did not rush our steps because a line does not rush when it means to be steady, and our officer would have none of that anyway. Smoke rose in slow folds from walls and timbers, and the flames walked the roofs with a sure foot as if they had been shown the way. Even in a city emptied of people, a man felt watched, because places remember those who make them, and that is an old truth. We held our post until the signal stick passed, and a runner said the rock had been taken. When the fires leaned our way, the heat pressed the cheeks like an open palm, and the warmth stood as a proof that a chapter had turned. It did not feel like a cheer, it felt like a page turned without a shout. Work followed as it always did, even after a place was claimed, and we were set to guard wells, count stores, and make the halls safe for rest. A small group went through houses to see if there was grain fit to carry, and another set piles for the fire so they would not leap where they should not. The men who had carried the rock came down with faces blackened, and a few leaned on their spears without shame while an officer noted names in a plain way. We were told not to break what was not meant to be broken, and to keep kits ready, because orders tend to walk in when men begin to sit. There was talk of the sea and the ships gathered there, and talk of a council that would point our steps, but talk does not move a foot. A little fountain near a wall gave enough to fill skins, and a line formed without pushing because men knew the value of small peace. When water met the tongue, it came cool and honest, and it reminded a tired heart that simple things still carried a man forward. It was like a father's hand on a shoulder, quiet and steady, and no one hurried that feeling. As evening took hold, the ranks settled along the streets and in the fields just beyond, and watch posts marked each turn where a stranger might wander. The city did not sound like a city, and that quiet made some uneasy, until an older hand said that a place without its people is only walls, and walls do not bite. A runner came by with word that the king would look to the sea, where the ships of both sides would decide a piece of the story, and that our guard would be near him when it came. The thought did not boil the blood. It set a kind of weight on the chest that is not fear, only the knowledge of being needed. Fires were kept small and clean, and the men ate without talk because the day had said enough. A few fixed sandals and patched a strap, and one or two wrote a name on a bit of wood to keep close in a pocket. The officers made their rounds with soft steps, because good order can speak in a low voice and be heard. Beyond the broken walls, the sea lay in lines of dark, and the last light touched it with a quiet shine that felt like a steady hand on a rough day. It told us that tomorrow had a place waiting, and that was enough. Chapter 6. Guarding the King after Salamis. After the hard news from the water at Salamis, the king's column moved by land, steady and close. The Immortals took their place around the royal carriage in 2 rings, spearmen nearest and archers set just beyond, because a guarded path was still a path toward tomorrow. Officers kept each file straight, and scouts ranged the slopes to mark any turn or bend. Wagons rolled in the line with what was needed, and scribes kept tallies while the road captain spoke the route. It was a shift from proud advance to firm escort, yet the habit of care did not change, since duty was the same before pride and after it. The rear guard watched the trail behind, where trouble liked to test, and pickets moved out when the column halted. The king's canopy stayed low and plain, and that helped keep the mind on work rather than show. At the center of it all, the beat that mattered set the tread and eased the breath, the deep thud of the march drums marking each step in calm time. Even kings needed a pace, and that was the way of ordered travel. Hands checked straps and knots without hurry, because a slow check kept small breaks from becoming large ones. The old sword at the hip, the little Achaemenid, sat where it always had during marches, a known weight that steadied the mind like an old friend who said little. Archers counted shafts by touch and habit, and spearmen eyed the ground for holes that could twist an ankle and ruin a man's place in the line. The captain of 100 moved along the files and spoke names, not to scold but to show that each place mattered and would be noted if empty. Runners moved between rings with clear words and careful faces, and the road held the mix of pride and worry that comes after a turn of fortune. There was a thought shared by many that care, more than edge, kept a host alive once the bright stories faded. The one anchor in the day was plain practice, and the leather-wrapped grip under the palm felt firm and sure. That simple press said hold on, and so the line did. Guard duty rose and fell by plan. The inner ring set the pace and watched the center. The outer ring watched the world, and both shifted places at named marks along the way. When change came, it came by sign rather than shout, because clear signs kept calm better than loud throats ever did. A runner from the staff walked ahead and raised a strip of cloth on a pole, and that single lift told the inner ring to slow and the outer to trade roles. Standards stood where they could be seen, and the old men in the files said the eye was quicker than the ear when hearts were already full. Scouts passed notes to the staff officer, and the staff officer passed them to the captain, so worry never had room to grow teeth. It all felt simple, and it was meant to, since simple steps turned fear into work. The old rule held, do the task before the tale. The sight of the cloth in the air was enough. And that was the plain truth of ordered moving. Camp came at set hours, not late and not early, because bodies needed a clock. Men stacked shields, staked the lines, and set the little hearth pans where the stewards said, talk stayed even, and sometimes a short joke passed along the row, which did more for spirits than long speeches ever could. The king's tent stood inside the guard ring, close enough that duty felt like being part of a single house. Letters were spoken aloud by those who could read, and stories went around about homes that waited and tools that would need hands again after the war. Wine was watered, bread was shared, and the cooks raised no fuss when a lad asked for a second bite after a lean day. A small gift from a comrade, a date pressed into a hand, sat on the tongue with a simple sweetness. That taste reminded a man that the world held good things beyond rank and rule. So camp felt human, and that was the way men held together. Trouble tried the edges sometimes, as it always does when a column stretched long and the road bent through gullies. A few bold ones shadowed the rear, peered from broken ground, and sent a dart or stone to see if the line would shake. The rear guard drew in a pace, and the archers stepped to where they could answer without stirring the hole. Officers kept hands low to calm the young men who wanted to rush, because rushing was not guarding, and guarding was the work. There were no grand moves, only steady ones that showed trouble it would meet more trouble if it came closer. A comrade nudged and grinned to ease the tight jaw of another, and that helped more than he knew. When the first reply went out, it was one measured thing from a sure hand, and the whistle from the shaft cut the air in a clean path. After that, the shadows pulled back, the line breathed, and the thought went around that quiet wins where noise would only spread fear. Word passed along that Mardonius would ask to stay and fight on in the plains, while the great king might choose the safer road home to gather strength. Such talk came through trusted mouths and was not thrown about to feed worry. A soldier did not vote, he made a place for a decision to stand, and that was honest work. The staff sent for captains. The captains stood before the royal tent, and the rest watched the signs that soon came down the chain. Some faces showed hope for rest and home. Others set like stone because the road forward needed their feet. Each man weighed the same questions in his own way, and there was care taken to keep the line from breaking into guesses. In that pause before the orders, a light breeze touched the cheek and cooled warm skin that had seen many long days. Such a small thing cleared the head better than talk. You knew choices at the top were heavy, and waiting without complaint was the right help to give. The column reached a river that ran wide but shallow, and a crossing was made with craft learned over many marches. Files tightened, spears slanted to guard the sides, and the forward men set themselves like posts so the rest could pass steady between them. On the near bank, a row of wicker shields, the spara, was planted as a small wall in case a rush came at the moment of change. Scouts watched both bends, and a signal man stood where all eyes could find him. The work was all patience and feet, not glory, and it pleased the old hands because neat steps held a host together. A cart's axle was lifted and eased by many hands at once so no part would snap, and that felt like the way families move a heavy chest. Talk stayed low, orders were clear, and the column moved without tangle. The river's touch rose to the calves and ran cold enough to make a man breathe sharper, but the line held the pace. After, the shore felt secure, and a hum of plain pride went around without any need to boast. At last the orders came out clean. The great king would turn east with his guard to make the long road home, and a chosen host would remain with Mardonius to seek a new field in Plataea. Names were called in a steady voice, and places were set without fuss, because division done well kept both parts strong. A few men crossed themselves in their own way, others bowed to a small thought of parents, wives, or children. The ring around the king tightened for the turn, while the rest marked the route south and west. It was said that each road is a thread in the same cloth, and that sounded right when a man's own feet stood at a fork. Orders reached the file in plain script with the king's sign upon them, and the chosen stood ready for the path that waited near Plataea. The only scent in that quiet moment came from the wax of the seal as the cord was cut. A calm settled in, and it felt like the kind that comes before work a man understands. The march would go on, and so would the story. Chapter 7. Stand near Plataea. The line had settled on the low ground west of the hills, and posts were set for a fresh day of trial. Men of the household guard stood shoulder to shoulder behind the spara wall, and archers found their gaps where the wicker shields met. Words passed down the files to watch the left, to mind the streambed, to hold spears level. Officers counted ranks with quiet care, and the front files knelt where the ground allowed. It was not showy work, yet it was the kind that kept a line whole, and most work of war was like that. The spara plates leaned at a steady angle, and breathing found a calm pace as the slope ahead was measured with the eyes. A comrade beside checked his grip and nodded without fear or boasting, as if another drill had begun and the day would follow known steps. The wicker rim felt rough against the palm, and it steadied the mind like a remembered habit. Old lessons spoke of keeping order before courage, and that truth never grew old. Rumor had claimed this field would belong to the boldest, but it often turned to the ones who held tight at the right time. That understanding kept the heart even as the morning orders reached the ears. It was a plain task to begin with, and plain tasks were usually the most needed. When the bowstrings were tested and the officers gave the word, arrows went out in a measured climb above the shield edge. Files took turns, so the fence of wicker never thinned, and shaft after shaft rose from behind the cover, a pattern learned in years of training. The archers counted breaths, then stepped back, and others took their place, so the rhythm did not break even when arms grew tired. Calm words played along the ranks to hold the angle, and the kneeling men changed places without a tangle. The line did not rush, since speed alone broke shape, and shape kept life. A messenger trotted along the rear with notes for the flanks, and bearers fetched bundles of spare shafts from the wagons with careful hands. The soft hiss of the shafts carried forward over the field, and it sounded like steady rain on a pond. In that sound there was comfort, for it meant the order still held. A thought rose that the first moves were always simple, and the mind should not try to see the whole day at once. 1 hour at a time was the way to carry a heavy load. Cavalry scouts came and went, and word ran back that light horse on the other side tested both wings with quick darts and feints. The flanking files answered by edging shields and spears a few paces outward, and the officers watched for gaps with hard eyes but easy tone. The horsemen tried to draw the line thin, then wheeled off, as horsemen always did when they hunted for a loose spot. Archers shifted some fire to the sides, and the front stayed steady, since fear at the edges could ripple through the whole pile of men. After each probe, the files drifted back to center, and the wall looked like a door shut again and again by careful hands. The habit of rotating the first rank kept arms fresh, and it had been hammered into the bones long before that day. There was little room for bright deeds, and that was a blessing, for bright deeds often cost too much. The drum of hooves on hard ground rolled along the flank, low and even, then faded each time they pulled away. That sound warned of quick harm, but also proved they had not broken through. It felt right to trust the drill more than guesswork, since guessing on a field often led the feet into trouble. Toward the middle of the day, heavy ranks from the other side formed in a long block and began to move in time, and spears pointed like a wooden hedge. Word came down the line to brace and keep the spara as a low wall, with the foremost men crouched and the second rank set to lean into them. The push was no surprise, since the plain begged for it, and strong men with long spears always tried to close when arrows had done their first work. Shields touched with a clack that was dull and firm, and the front of the hedge met the wicker wall with a steady shove. That was the moment when talk stopped and breathing found a hard count, and the body knew the drill must carry the mind. The jolt of spear on shield ran through wrists and elbows like a knock on a door, and the habit of bracing passed the shock from one man to the next. A comrade's shoulder pressed in, and the pressure felt like a weight shared by many hands. It had always been taught that no one man held a line. The line held any man who stood in it. Believing that truth made the shove less sharp, signals waved for the front to step and set, so the hedge of spears could be turned aside by small moves rather than one grand throw. Files eased right or left as the push shifted, and the shield edges overlapped where danger rose the highest. The archers behind picked their shots above the low wall when a gap showed, then ducked back as the second rank raised the wicker higher. The ground felt honest enough, firm under sandals with only a few ruts to mind, and honest ground made hard work steadier. A standard showed above the line with a square of deep blue cloth, and it was a comfort to see it where it should be. A runner slowed long enough to speak to the officer, and then he hurried on, since no one lingered at the front more than duty asked. Patience and small steps answered big courage, and that rule had saved lives in other places and days. The blue square of the standard stood clear in the press, and that sight kept the shape of the unit in the head. Knowing where the piece belonged helped each man find his part, which was all that could be asked. At places along the wall, the press grew close, and short blades came out where a spear shaft broke or tangled, and men worked low to keep the hedge from spilling through. The second rank crouched to jam the wicker higher, and the third leaned in to give weight, while archers slipped their last good arrows to the surest hands. Breath came harsh but regular, and minds counted the beats as if on a march, since counting kept fear from growing big. There was little room to swing wide, so work stayed short and neat, since wide moves left one open to a hard thrust. A comrade hissed a warning, and the point that came through met wood, then slid off, and the shield edge rose again by habit alone. The iron taste at the back of the tongue marked strain, as it always did when effort went long. That taste had shown up in drills too, and its return felt almost friendly in a plain way. It helped to recall that tired men had held worse spots by simple steadiness, and simple steadiness was still within reach. News moved that the left had bent a little, so the center pressed a pace forward to keep the curve smooth instead of broken. The front files spread a finger's width to share the weight, then closed it again, and these small shapes made the whole picture hold together. The line did not run or brag, it worked the way a gate works, with hinges strong and steady, while the leaf moved just enough. The men at the very edge kept time by the calls of the officer there, and the shift of his voice was all they needed to know where to put their feet. A thought passed that the worst part of any day in arms was often a small part, and the rest was care and patience. The sharp scent of crushed time rose for a moment from trampled turf near the ditch, and it carried a plain memory of home gardens. That small reminder pulled the mind back to the reasons a man took pay and kept faith. The bend did not become a break, and the files told themselves this was only a hard turn on a long road. Good sense held the curve, and good sense could be trusted. Late in the day, the push eased, and then started again in short bursts, as if the will on the other side fought with its own tired legs. The front had learned the weight of that shove, and had found the right lean to answer it without spilling the wall. Archers passed down what they had left to men who could place a shot in a tight moment, and bearers slipped forward with fresh shields where the wicker had torn. The shape of the unit still matched the thought drilled into it, and that was worth more than a dozen bright moves. A quiet hope rose that night would come soon enough to let men refill quivers and mend straps. And quiet hope was not a sin on a hard day. A cool breath of wind touched the back of the neck and made the skin tighten for a moment, and the small change felt like a promise of rest. It seemed clear that tomorrow would ask more than today, and that was no surprise after all that had come before. The line set itself for another shove, knowing the order to yield might come with the dawn. It was easier to face that truth with the wall still standing. Chapter 8: Break and Withdrawal from Plataea. The ground under the files seemed to lean as the Spartan phalanx pressed in, shields tight and spears set low, and the standard to the right dipped, then steadied, while the hand signs moved down the ranks. The order to give ground reached the front, and feet shifted as trained 3 paces back, halt, brace, then 3 more when the next touch came. A comrade beside breathed slow and counted under his breath, keeping the rhythm as if it were practice. The center bent first, then straightened, then bent again, which was expected when a hard push came at one point. It felt like opening a gate in small steps, each hinge cared for by calm hands that knew their work. There was no hurry, because hurry broke lines, and lines held lives. The rear files made room and turned slightly to guide the bend toward a rise behind. That was how the line lived when the day turned against it. The taste of dust filled every mouth with a dry coat that stuck to the tongue, and it reminded each man that the land chose the pace as much as orders did. It was steady, not brave in a loud way, but steady the way old habits were steady, and steadiness saved more than shouts did. The horn to the left gave 2 short calls, then 1 long, and the sound slid along the files as sure as rope pulled hand to hand. That meant the rear ranks would step first, then the front would drift back to meet them, like doors closing toward the hinge. A guide rope on the right kept the course, and the banner pole on the left kept the line true by eye and by trust. Officers said little, because every man knew the rule of the count, and the rule stood even when hearts hammered as hard as hammers. A standard bearer ahead checked his step, then lifted the pole higher so the cloth could be seen above the helms in front. The ground did not favor a quick turn, so the bend had to grow out of patient steps. That was the way of it, in open fields against men who pressed without hurry and without fear. The horn sounded again, a single note stretched and held just long enough that the mind could settle. People often thought fighting was a rush, but the work of leaving a field alive was almost always a matter of keeping time. Archers shifted to a low rise and sent arrows in wide arcs as the line eased back, and the sight of the fletched shafts curving like dark birds helped measure the space gained. A small knot of spearmen formed a screen, points out, while the main files settled some distance behind them. When the enemy pushed up the slope, their steps slowed, and the screen backed away by pairs, each one giving the other a heartbeat to turn. The files did not run, because running turned order into a scatter, and scatter fed fear. A captain raised his hand flat, then turned his palm, and the screen slid aside to let the main line breathe. The right refused a little, protecting the wagons that had moved to the rear at first light. The left bent toward a dry bank that could prove a friend, and that kind of small friend made a large difference when men in bronze came forward without a break. The sight of the arcs falling in front of their ranks showed the archers still had clear ground to work, which meant there was still time to move with care. It was simple work in the telling, and hard work in the doing, and that was true of most things that mattered. A shallow stream lay across the course, no more than to the ankles in most places, and the line turned to meet it in a slow, even drift. Guides spread along the bank pointed out the firm spots, and the first rank found the path, then paused until the second rank touched their shoulders. Men moved over in pairs, keeping spears forward and shields presented without fuss, just as they had practiced behind the drill yard walls. A wagon's axle had been dragged through earlier in the day, and the mark gave a path to follow without second guessing. Retreat felt like a frail word for careful work like this, but names never held all the weight of a thing. A few shapes fell out to the sides to watch the crest behind, then slipped back when it was clear enough. The far bank gave a small rise and a better base for heels, and a hand went up to signal the brief halt. The cold touch of river water at the ankles cut clean through the heat of the long day and brought clear minds back to the front of the head again. A job done with a level head was still a job done, even when it meant stepping away. There was a sharp push at the center when a wedge of them tried to force the crossing, and for a moment the front bent more than it should, then righted when the second rank closed up tight. One man near the bank went down and was pulled by his belt by a fellow who did not even look to see who he had saved because the line mattered more than the name in that breath. The captain paced behind the first rank with his spear butt tapping the ground when the count shifted. He did not need to say much because the line heard the count and the count told the body what to do. A comrade to the left murmured a small joke about old knees and new orders, and a few shoulders loosened. The small rise beyond the stream gave a place to breathe, and the files lengthened there by a hand's width, which helped. The sharp smell of crushed thyme under sandals rose from the bank and cut through other thoughts long enough to clear a place for courage. Such small things helped more than pride when weight came down old roads. Pride broke easy, but habit and a good joke and a steady hand, those held firm. On the low ridge the line reformed and set the spara edge to edge, a woven wall that had saved many days and would save more if men stayed calm and close. The captain called for a bound step back by ranks, and the front held until the third was in place, then drifted to meet them, not an inch more than needed. Archers tucked in at the corners and kept their hands quick, because time could be bought in small coins if the purse did not spill. The ground fell away behind, and that slope promised a shield for the next turn east. A man at the standard rubbed his neck and looked only as far as the banner cloth, since eyes that went too far tended to bring the mind with them. The push from below eased when the enemy paused to dress their line, which was a gift of a few breaths, and those breaths bought the next move. The bite of the shield strap on the forearm reminded hands to hold and not drift, a simple pain that kept thoughts where they belonged. Hard lessons learned in quieter years did their work now, and that had always been the reason for drills. Once the ridge was cleared, the files eased toward the fields that led to Thebes, with cavalry sliding across the front in loose sweeps that kept bold men from running too close. The rear ranks stayed firm, trading places with the middle every few hundred steps so no single part of the line carried the whole burden. A few stones marked the path where wagons had passed before, and they gave the guides a line to follow, which saved the mind from doubt. There was no fierce shout in it, just the steady tone of officers who had crossed bad ground before and planned to cross worse later if need be. A comrade checked the ties on a pack and passed a word that the next halt would be at a grove where the earth dipped and gave a tight lane to hold. The job was to go on, and the job was to do it as one body, not as scattered men. The glow of late light on the far hills stretched long and red, and it softened hard edges in ways that helped the heart believe in the next bend in the road. The day had been hard, but hard days always ended if men kept their step and their count. Behind, dust hung where the field had been, and ahead, fences and low walls showed human hands had tamed this part of Boeotia long before any of this was thought of. A rider pointed out a track that would let the files turn without breaking, and that was taken without a debate, because small choices decided big fates. The captain passed down the word that no man was to break from his file for water or for talk, and it was taken in with quiet nods. The wagons found a lane and rolled on, steady and slow, because haste broke wheels more often than stones did. A few of the enemy tried to press once more, then lost heart when cavalry drew close enough to make them think twice about loose steps. The line did not look back, because looking back did not change the ground underfoot, and ground underfoot was what kept breath in a chest. The banner did not waver, and that mattered more than any speech. The dim band of evening along the horizon grew wider, a soft bar that promised a cooler march and a better road. That was enough promise for now, and enough is all a soldier ever truly had. Chapter 9. Long Road Back to Susa. The long road back began after the lines pulled clear of Boeotia, and the order to turn east passed from file to file. Packs hung a little lower, and talk went quieter when names came up that no one would answer to again. A leather pouch rode against the belt where pay had been sealed, the knot checked each morning out of habit, and a small wish. The march looked smaller now, though banners still rose and officers still walked the edges like men minding a flock. So the steps went on, steady and sure, because that was the way of the king's soldiers. In the evenings, someone would speak softly about home, then fall into silence as if the words had been enough. A comrade beside would pass a crust of bread, or point to the next ridge as if distance could be measured by kindness. There had been battles enough for any tale, yet most of the way back carried small tasks. Straighten a strap, mend a sandal, weave thoughts around memories, and let them sit. A slow ache worked up from the soles and into the calves with each mile, and it reminded the legs that glory did not carry the load. That was the way of things, and it kept the heart even. Posts along the royal road appeared at good intervals, and the line took comfort in the routine of gates, ledgers, and a roof. Couriers on fresh horses came and went with a nod and a dusted salute, while wagons rolled into their yard and found a tight space. Pilgrims and traders stepped aside for the shields, and the men made room in return when their day allowed. At one station, a governor's clerk counted heads and moved on, all brisk and neat, and the officer ahead thanked him for clear work. It all felt smaller than a field of spears, and yet it stitched the way home with care. When the pack shifted, the leather pouch bumped the hip in a steady beat, and that small weight felt like a promise kept. A mule train passed close on a narrow bit of road, and the tin bells on the lead animal chimed in a patient loop. The sound marked the pace better than a shouted count, and the feet fell in with it as surely as if guided by a drum. It was an ordinary thing, and ordinary things steadied the mind. Hill country took the march into stiff climbs and careful steps, and small villages watched the line from doorways. A boy pointed at the blue and white tassels and smiled until his mother drew him back inside, then waved again as the line rounded a bend. There were no speeches out here, only nods and the trade of news for the road ahead. A comrade told the story of a friend who had stood firm at the hot gates, and another spoke in answer about a shield partner near Plataea, and both fell quiet in the end. No one argued about who had done more. That was the way of men who had seen both narrow passes and open fields. When the cook fires lit in a village close to the road, a calm drift came over the men, for it meant a place with water and a spot to sit for a while. The smell of wood smoke slid across the track and settled like a hand on the shoulder. It reminded the body of nights at home when work had ended and the day had no more demands to make. Memory helped when the path climbed again, and the line took the next rise with a steady will. At a larger post, the officers called everyone to stand for the roll and the checking of pay. Scribes sat with boards and inks and asked for names and marks, and the old habit of order returned as surely as a beaten track underfoot. When the pouch came open, the coin inside looked like a bright sun trapped in earth metal, and each man was told to keep it safe for his people. The word for that piece travelled down the files, a Darrick, fair weight and honest face. No one spoke too loudly about it, for coin that reached home did more than a boast made on the road. An older trooper told a younger one to stitch the pouch tie again, then nodded when he saw it done. Even in that small moment, the line felt like a household, with many hands and one purpose. Some laughed about the slow clerk who counted the same men twice, and the laugh did its work, for a little humour patched thin places in the spirit. The coin's gleam sat in the mind's eye like a lamp, and it was good to let it rest there without fuss. That was the way to keep a straight back. After the check, a long halt gave time for cooking, and camp life folded into its familiar shape. A pot hung from a simple frame, and men took turns stirring without being told, each pass of the hand obeying a rhythm learned young. Someone sang a marching song in a low voice that rose and fell like a wagon on ruts, and others joined in when the words came back to them. A veteran told a story about the king riding along the ranks once, not far, just enough, and the way that sight had held men steady during a hard climb. Around the pot, jokes grew easier, and faces loosened as if the lines had been rubbed away. When the stew was ready, the ladle moved from hand to hand, and bread broke in honest pieces. The taste of the salted goat and herbs filled the mouth with simple comfort. For a time the war seemed like it had moved to a far hill, still there, but small. A man saved a scrap for the next march, and another gave his to a thin dog that had followed the column for days. That was the way of soldiers, to keep something, to give something, and to trust the next dawn. The march went down to a broad river and paused while ferries and a simple bridge made from many parts were set ready. Officers spoke with the men who ran the crossing and arranged the order, and nothing about it felt grand, yet 1,000 small acts joined to carry the host. Shields were stacked, spears stood in bundles, and the files stepped where told, because a safe passage meant more than a quick one. A comrade kept a hand on the belt of the man ahead, and the habit steadied both. On the far bank, the line formed again without a shout, as if the river had taught patience that needed no words. Someone reached down, scooped a little water, and rubbed it over knuckles and face before moving on. Cool, wet skin brought a brief ease, like a cloth set on a tired brow. It did not change the march, but it changed the next few steps, and that was enough. The camp that night sat on level ground, and the watch moved in pairs from post to post, untroubled. A quiet order held everything together, the only way a long road did not break good men. Fields began to widen, and more people walked the sides of the road with baskets and little carts as the column neared home country. The talk turned to houses, to wives, to fathers, to a sister who would make a meal, to a courtyard that would look the same as it always had. The leather pouch was checked again, not out of fear, but as a way to think of the faces that would be glad to see it. A shrine by a bend took a few men to its steps, where simple gestures were done with the hand, and the officer let them take a moment without a word. A scribe from the post spoke of news from the capital, and the word was that the king had gone north for a time, and then back, and that life in the cities had carried on. Near an irrigation channel, sandals could press into soft ground, and the scent that lifted from the damp gave a thought of fields ready for seed. That was a good sign because a well-watered land promised steady days. When the sun lowered, the line kept moving, patient and sure, because a day's work was to finish the day. Susa came close not with trumpets but with plain sights. More walls, more gardens, more people who knew the colors and nodded without staring. Work crews made room as the column passed a storehouse, and a woman held her child to the side and smiled as if the world fit again when men returned in order. Some who had left boys looked older now, and some who had left friends found they would walk in alone. At the gate, guards checked names and gave a short welcome, as if to say that all who went out had a place to come back to. The barracks received the line, and packs were set down in the same corners they had left, which felt right. A clerk read out a message to 2 ranks, and one line said that a detail would go on to the palace at Persepolis for the watch. A hand rose at that, not from pride, but from the thought that steady duty would be better than a march for a while. A spear rested against the wall, and when the fingers closed on it, the shaft pressed its known weight into the palm with a calm, cool surety. The years bent toward work, and that too felt sound. Chapter 10. The watch and the weight of years, Persepolis, lay behind the terrace like a carved promise, and the day's watch had stood with spears planted and eyes easy. The post had been the same as ever, a corner of the stair, a lane to the gate, a count of heads going in and out. The steps had been steady, and the line had kept its shape without fuss. A hand had rested on the shaft to keep the stance neat, and the point had stayed level the way old teachers once showed. The old drill had still lived in the bones even when the legs had tired by noon. The cool weight of metal in the palm had linked the day to the march years ago, and the link had felt sound. That sort of touch told a man where he stood. The palace had not moved, though faces had changed and stories had been told and retold at the barrack fire. It had been easy to see how a life could fold into simple posts like this. That was how the years worked on a soldier, slow and honest. The guard at the next pillar had nodded from time to time, and small jokes had gone back and forth. The watch had held, and the city had breathed in its high place, the way it always did when the king was at home, and the names of the dead were kept without noise. It had felt right to be there. New men had come in files, hair still too neat, and sandals not yet worn at the heel, and the old hands had shown them the plain things. Spear butt set by the right foot, chin easy, eyes ahead, a cloak folded tight so it did not flap over the grip. A belt sat right so the short blade hung where a hand found it without a search. One strip of leather had kept the kit simple, and the point had been cleaned to reflect the light in a way a captain liked, though fancy would not save a life. The smell of oil on the cloth had marked the moment when metal turned dark to bright, and the boys had smiled at their own work. The thing was to love the plain ways, not the grand talk, and that truth had gone down better than lectures. The old body had shown rather than said, because tricks lived in fingers better than in words. It had felt good to pass on the care that once had kept a man safe at a pass far away. That was the quiet trade of service. Gate duty had called for calm mouths and clear heads more than for muscle. A watchword had changed with the moon, and the order had passed down the line like water moved from jug to jug. A clerk had kept a slate, and a captain had signed the change at the hour so no one could claim a mistake later if trouble came. Soft steps had come up the stair, and an officer's shadow had broken the sun on the stone for a breath, then had gone. The sound of sandals on the great stairs had tapped out a slow count, a music known to every guard who had ever stood that place. Names had been said low and clear, and hands had lifted in brief salute. The habit had made the hard things easy, which was the point of habit. The fear that had once risen in tight valleys had not needed to live here, yet memory had set the stance. It had been good to find that the same quiet that once steadied a spear in a press could steady a word at a gate. That was a kind of victory too, small but true. Breaks had come as they always did, and the bench under the shade had taken its share of backs. The mess boy had set down bread and dates with a nod, and talk had gone soft and warm. A cup had passed, and memories had walked in and sat for a while like old friends who did not mind silence. The taste of dates had carried a sweetness that never changed, and it had brought to mind a tree passed in a dusty town on the long road west. A joke had run along the bench about a captain's frown and a recruit's mismatched sandals, and even the most stern had let a grin slip. Work had returned soon enough, so a man had learned not to waste the soft minutes. It had been clear that food and talk kept the spirit in line just as drill kept the body. There had been no shame in that. When the bell had called the line back to the pillar, the men had stood lighter, and the day had moved on without strain. That was the rhythm that held an army together when no war song was needed. On days when the court had shown itself, the terrace had filled with colour and measured steps, and the guard had kept shape while nobles passed. A messenger had hurried and then slowed at the rail, because haste looked poor in that place. Priests had made their signs, and the rest had watched from the edges, as if it were a story told to them. A torch in the hall had been lit even by noon for the ceremony, and the warmth of its small flame had settled on knuckles when the line stood close to the door. Some had said the king's peace lived in these small shows, and perhaps that had been true. A man who had seen tight passes and broken ground had known that peace was not a simple thing. It needed hands steady on quiet days. The talk outside had said much about glory, but the hallway had taught patience and care. The young had learned to set the spear without clatter, and to bow without fear, which mattered as much as bravado. In that way myth had met the steps, and had become the steady walk of a day's duty. Even with work set and pay fair, the mind had wandered to faces no longer in the role. A small chest at the foot of a bed had held odd bits saved from roads and camps, and a palm had moved over them on a slow night. A bronze buckle had come from a friend who had never reached home, and a scrap of cloth had been tied with a knot that only two had known. The smell of cedar from the chest's lining had come up clean when the lid opened, and it had carried a piece of winter from the old hills. Memory had a way of coming quiet, and it had asked for time rather than tears. That had been wise because the lines still needed a steady face by day. There had been no shame in missing those gone, nor in speaking their names in a low voice at the end of a prayer. In the end, a soldier had lived in company, and even the lost had stayed in that company, just out of sight. That was how the weight sat and did not crush the chest. The drill yard had seen its share of late afternoons when the sun went soft and the squad circled round the old hand. A shield wall had been shaped on the chalk line so the measure of steps did not slip, and one by one the boys had learned to place the rim where it would catch a push rather than slide. The sparrer had felt wide to them, but the trick had been to think as a row, not as a single man with a big board. The rough bite of the wicker grip under the fingers had told each man where home was when noise would try to steal the mind. The short blade, the Achaemenids, had hung ready but quiet, because a good line kept enemies at the point of the long spear and made the small blade a last thing. Laughter had mixed with grunts as each tried and failed and tried again because skill grew from stumbles. The story of the hot gates had been told plain, without big words, only the steps, so their feet could wear that path in their own way. That was the clean gift an older soldier could give. Nights had come, and the terrace had cooled as shadows reached across the stones. A last round had been walked with a new man beside, and the old talk had been given one more time. Keep the line, mind the gate, trust the calm more than the noise in your head. A glance at the city walls had shown that they still stood like they always had, and that had done more for the heart than any speech. The breeze on the cheeks had been light as the post changed hands, and a nod had sealed the trust. The younger one had set his spear just so, eyes forward, shoulders easy, and in that small act an old march had found its rest. This had not been the roar of a field, but it had been the center of a life all the same. Even a long road had to settle somewhere, and this was a good place. The weight had been shared, which was the only way to carry it. The watch had gone on with a steady beat, and the years had joined like links in a chain, one into another, simple and sure. And so, our time among the immortals draws to a close. The clash of spears fades, the march drums grow quiet, and the long road home returns to dust. Until our next story together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.